What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. Tonight, we are continuing our discussion of the steps and how they help us achieve emotional sobriety. And the last several weeks, we've devoted to looking at step 8, which is made a list of all people we had harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. And I mentioned as we started to really look at this is that as we make a list of the people we've harmed and we looked at the harm we've caused ourselves and others, that we're going to see a certain pattern to our behavior. Now, we're focusing on how the steps help us achieve emotional sobriety. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of self-awareness in the achievement of emotional sobriety. You see, we need to become aware of how we create our existence if we're going to be able to do anything about it. And so here, in steps 6 and 7, we were pivoting towards how, I need to develop the best possible attitude I can have towards myself, towards my relationships with others, and also towards life. And so here we're told now, in the development of that best possible attitude, let's become aware of these patterns. And the one thing that I've asked us to stop and think about in terms of, the harm that we've caused is to look at what our self-hate has done to ourselves. Now, most people, when they look at the harm that's done to themselves with their addiction, they look at the result of whatever substance they've been addicted to, whether it's food, alcohol, or other drugs, or sex, or gambling, or whatever it is, and they look at the harm in terms of through the lens of the impact of their addiction. Of course, that's an important thing to look at, because there's no question that we put ourselves in harm's way with those things that we've done. But I'm asking you to go deeper than that. I'm asking you to now consider self-hate, as I hesitate to call it this, but it seems like the original sin. It's our first betrayal of ourselves. It's the first step towards now disowning ourselves, rejecting ourselves, and believing. And we're going to call this part of that big lie, believing that I have to be somebody other than I am to be okay. So at that moment that I start on that journey that Dr. Karen Horney calls the search for glory, because I'm looking for the answer that's going to make me okay. So this is the search for glory. So as soon as I reject myself to find the answer to that, I've now created this self-hating process. If I am the way I should be, then I'm okay. If I'm not, then I hate myself for it. And I'm going to punish myself. I'm going to be angry with myself, put myself down, hurt myself, terrorize myself, all the things we've talked about to try to get myself back in line with who I think I should be. And that's why, most of us in the program, and I rarely have met a person that doesn't feel like we're not enough as we are, because that's what that rejection did to ourselves. Now, we've talked about the direct forms of self-hate and how they manifest themselves. Last couple of times, I started to talk about the indirect forms, and I talked about this creating illusions as an indirect form of self-hate. And I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit more before I turn to how our self-hate also now starts to harm our relationships and harm other people in our life. Because remember, if we're judging ourselves as harshly, then we're going to also be judging other people that don't live up to our expectations, right? So if I'm not living up to my expectations, the golden rule is not that we do to others what we'd like them to do to us. What we do to others is what we're doing to ourselves. That's the problem here. We treat other people the way we treat ourselves, and that's not good news, because this stuff is going to leak out, right? It's going to impact, it's going to infect our relationships with everyone, because it's infecting our relationship with ourselves. So this illusion that I adopt means that I start imagining that I have to be a certain way, you have to be a certain way, and life has to be a certain way for me to be okay. Now, what makes that an indirect form of self-hate? Well, you see, it's reinforcing this idea that I cannot cope with reality, that I am not okay. I am not good enough the way I am. I have to be something other than I am. Reality is something that has to measure up to my expectations for me to be okay in life. You have to be a certain way for me to be okay in life. So these illusions, are created by this desperation. I'm looking for a solution to life. I'm looking for a way of being in this world that's going to work. So this desperation I have that comes out of that basic anxiety then creates these illusions. And as Dr. Lowen, Alexander Lowen, the father of bioenergetics therapy, so brilliantly said, he says, desperation creates illusions, and then illusions create more desperation, and desperation creates more illusions, and we get caught in this loop. And we dig ourselves further and further into that hole. So when we go back and look at step one and talk about the unmanageability of our life, oh yes, of course it's unmanageable. How can it be manageable when now I've got to dedicate my life to actualizing a concept of who I should be that is going to be riddled with all this self-hate to try to keep me in line to become what I'm not, as though that's the answer to my life. God, what a house of cards we built. And of course, when things don't go our way, that house of cards, what happens to it? Well, it crumbles. Of course it's going to crumble. We're not on a solid foundation. We're not connected to our actual and true self and accepting our actual and true self and dedicating ourselves to actualizing who we are. We've rejected ourselves. So this is a serious, serious issue. And it undermines so many things because it generates these illusions, right, are generated from this idea, and this is where my emotional dependency comes in, that I am okay if I live up to my expectations. I'm okay if you live up to my expectations. I'm okay if life lives up to my expectations. And look, we even do that thing in relationship to God as we understand him or her. Right? If God does what I want God to do, then I'm going to be okay. So we pursue these illusions until we have what's called a crisis of personal limitation. That we hit a point in our life where we realize the crisis is that the way that I'm doing this doesn't work. I have built a house of cards. I'm like one of the three pigs that first builds a house of stone and then a house of wood. And then finally, hopefully recovery is about building that house with some bricks in it. So it's going to stand up to no matter what happens. Never thought of myself as one of the three pigs before. The straw house I built first, then I tried wood. Now in recovery, I'm starting to lay a few bricks in my life, Oh my God, Ellen Berger's going into nursery rhymes now and talking about emotional sobriety with the three little pigs. Um, but that's what happens, right? That's what happens, right? That if my house is built on this idea that life has to conform to my expectations for me to be okay, then as soon as life doesn't, I'm knocked off balance. Emotional sobriety is getting to a place where I'm okay, even if things don't turn out the way I think they should. I'm okay, even if I'm not the way I think I should. Making a mistake and then dealing with it versus making a mistake and thinking I'm a mistake. And that's what self-hate does. It globalizes, this concept of ourselves that we are no good, we're incapable. And I'm going to, today we're going to think about that as part of that big lie, right? That big lie that I need reality to be a certain way rather than that I can find a way to cope with life. I can find a way to cope with myself. I can find a way to cope with my relationships as they are. That's the key here. That's what we're striving to do. But I have to see how much I've lived my life in fantasy. And that's what all this is about. The self-hate is creating these fantasies. And now I try to live these fantasies as though that's what I need to be okay rather than dealing with things as they are. So I wanted to make sure that we get this very important point before we now turn to seeing how our self-hate starts to impact others. Because we've got to see that these illusions we have for ourselves now are going to be illusions that we project out onto the world and that we project onto our relationships. And that we demand then things to be a certain way, our partners to be a certain way, life to be a certain way, people that are in, our circle, both our inner and outer circles to be a certain way. Because we think we need things to be that way to be okay. So we are in the process of moving from an I'm okay if to an I'm okay even if mentality. That's the path we're on. That is the essence of emotional sobriety. Now, we do that because every one of these things that we're doing to move us in this direction is rooted in the process of differentiation. So I'm going to keep coming back to that all the time. Somebody was talking to me the other day. It says, well, can you tell me how in Al-Anon we talk about detachment? And detachment seems to be moving in that direction. And I says, you're right. I think Al-Anon really has had this focus on differentiation without using that term differentiation. They use the term detachment. And I said, but the difference is, and this is very important to hear, that why I like the term differentiation more is because detachment talks about disconnection from. And when we differentiate, we don't have to disconnect from. We can stay connected to, but be aware of the differences. Be aware of our separateness and still maintain the connection. Eric Fromm really captured this incredibly when he talked about his idea of mature love. Mature love, in Eric Fromm's definition, is a love that's based on being differentiated. And he called it union with the preservation of integrity. Union, I like to think of it with the preservation of individuality. It's joining togetherness with the preservation of separateness. It's being able to hold both of those in the same, that paradox, and holding them together in the same, at the same level without the disconnection. Because you will hear me say, as we're moving more and more towards the achievement of emotional sobriety, is what we do is when we are in trouble, we stay connected to the trouble and we add more self. And it's the adding of more self that will help you differentiate. We will be getting into that more and more as we continue this journey with the steps, because you're going to see all the tools we're getting is to how to bring that healthy self into our lives, not the childlike, what did Harry Tebow call it? He says in all the alcoholics he met, he's found that the infantile aspects of the child's ego seem to persist into adulthood. We're not talking about that self, the self that demands things, that goes our way. We're talking about a more mature self, a spiritual self, if you want to call it that, a self that's aware of ourselves and others. It's not just the self that is so self-centered and focused, because that's what happens. If I'm undifferentiated, then everything's about me. Once I become differentiated, it's not all about me. You're there present too. I'm aware of you as much as I'm aware of me. It's not a one-sided deal at all, because that connection is important to me. And so when I'm differentiated, I can honor that. But when I'm undifferentiated, I can't. Either I'm going to get lost in you, or I'm going to say, screw you. I'm going to do one or the other, because I don't know how to stay connected and keep a sense of myself. So that will be leading us into our discussion next week, which will be on looking at what does this emotional dependency and my self-hate, how does it impact our relationships with others? And when we think about making amends to them, I am thinking we're going to be looking at that from a very, very different perspective than most of us have looked at it. So with that, I will invite my two dear friends and colleagues to share with you some of their thoughts from what I've shared right now, or what they're thinking about. So there's Raj. And
hey.
Hey, Tom. Hey, Al.
Hey, Raj.
Hey, you guys.
Well, you me go?
Go ahead.
All right. You don't seem enthused, but it's, I won't take it personally. It's because I just want to do a brief little piece that you reminded me of one of the ways that when you talk about the indirect ways that we do self-hate, and as we've gone through this round, I have a / self-hate, self-negate, because first of all, it rhymes, and I like things that rhyme in therapy. But the other thing is, it also is sometimes a really good way of describing it for me when I think about self-negation. And I started thinking about it when you began, Alan, when you were talking about basically, we're not enough, we're too much, we're too little, we're a mistake, we're not quite right. We have all these messages that wherever we get it, the source may be external, maybe experiential through some experience we have. But once we adopt these beliefs, the lie, like you say, is then we're and you started by saying that we can't be who we are. We have to be someone else. So when I think about it in terms of creativity and it takes creativity to be as dysfunctional as most of us are, by the way. So we should give ourselves credit for that. It's like most of us are pretty well versed in being creative. And so I think about it as, if I can't be who I am, I'm going to create a character for myself. I'm going to, and this is an unconscious thing. I think it's important to keep coming back to this. Some of this stuff we may have glimpses of, and we may have known about ourselves all along. But for the most part, the bigger plan that we're talking about, that Alan describes as we go along, is an unconscious process for us. And so I don't know that I'm writing a story, and I don't know that I'm creating, a character to replace me. But if I am doing that, and this is the going to the indirect way, my seeing this in an indirect way. If I'm a character in a story, if my character is persecuted, then I need other characters in my story that will persecute me. If I am always wrong, if that's my thing, then I need other people pointing that out to me. So these are the things that I'm going to project unconsciously out into the world. If I am great, if I am an amazing person, then I'm going to need people to praise me and point that out to me. And so we don't get this at the time, but through therapy, we look back and go like, oh my God, this is how creative we've been. We've been able to, first of all, part of it is we seek out the right people. If I'm a rescuer, what do I need? I need people who need to be rescued. Now sometimes this is one of the ways that I will have harmed people, that I will discover later that I will have harmed people, is I might actually be pretty good at turning somebody who doesn't need to be rescued into somebody who needs to be rescued. It's like, if you're not a train wreck by the time you meet me and start dating me, just wait, hang out with me for a little while and we'll see what we can do.
On the job training, right?
We'll see what we can do. But we're also very good at, at finding out, unconsciously seeking and attracting these people that will reinforce our stories. And of course, they're reinforcing their own stories as well. And so we do that. And so one of the things I had not thought about until tonight, Alan, is that as we do this creative work of creating our story, trying our best to be the person we think we're supposed to be, one of the ways that we are setting ourselves up, and like we said, we're going to talk next time about how we actually do inflict harm on other people. And we're talking about ways that are different, like you said, that are different than what we've done previously when we've done 8 and 9 step. It's like, because those are the easy ones. Those are the ones where, how many times was I drunk and just a complete asshole to you? How many times did I let you down? All these things, and these are important and big and they count. It's how much of a disappointment was I to my first wife and my stepchildren in that family. It's like all that's there, but with looking at it deeper, looking at it go more toward the core of our authentic self, of our real self. That's what I'm getting out of this, is how we're creating these stories and how our own story, as creative as it might be, is actually going to be harmful to the people who encounter me. So that's one of the things I'm getting out of this.
I love it, Tom. What a great elaboration of the principle. What came to mind when you were saying it, it's like we have a casting director inside of us, right?
New member of the committee. Yeah.
Member of the committee. I just found a new member of my committee, and we're now, taking auditions.
That's fine.
You don't fit. I'm sorry. You're too healthy for me. There's no way this is going to work out. I need somebody else that cannot stand up to this stuff that I'm doing. I mean, that's right. Brilliant, Tom. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Very nice.
Thank you.
You really sweetened the pot tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. I knew there was a reason I wanted you to go first tonight, and that was it.
Okay.
Way to bring in how we then, if we're lost in that need to create a false self, how we will absolutely utilize other people in that quest, right?
Well, one of my favorite things about it is, because this is just something I realized many years ago now, is that one of the things as somebody who values my creativity and my creative stuff so much, I just, I see that when, that's one of the places it's like, no surprise to anybody. If I will connect with people with their sense of humor anytime it's possible. And I promise you, there are people who you think don't have a sense of humor, and I can walk in and I'll say, watch this. And we're going to find that sense of humor, because that's just it's a language. That's Alan's seen me do this.
Oh, God. I was thinking of John Amodeo. I invited him to come, by the way.
We've made bets on this. I've made money on doing this, by the way. This is, but the idea, I love the idea of also reframing for ourselves as we're going through this. And this is really a healing aspect for the self-hatred, is let's also give ourselves credit for the creativity. This is just what recovery is. It's about using that power for good rather than destructive purposes or hurting people and hurting ourselves. But we are creative. And it's like there's a lot of good jokes. I can run on that idea of creativity in our dysfunction, but it's really true. And I think it's a really nice thing to be able to say to ourselves, is even in the midst of that shit, it's like, I'm pretty clever.
Yeah. A couple of thoughts. One is, Alan, I was really happy to hear you emphasize tonight that when we're talking about being in a crisis or being in serious trouble, how important it is to think in terms of adding more self to that, to that, bringing more self to that situation. But what I especially love tonight is you emphasized that we're not talking about adding more king baby to that situation. We're not talking about adding more of our really unhealthy, what we sometimes call narcissistic impulses to that situation, that's not going to help. Okay. And especially if my inclination in my life, my pattern is to be very self-centered in that negative sense. And I hear the message of, oh, well, the key for me to move forward is to add more of that kind of self-centeredness. I'm just going to create more trouble and more disaster. But if we think about the self as more of our spiritual self, more of our more mature self, as you said, both of those terms tonight, then I feel like we start to get on very solid ground about what's going to help us and those around us move forward. Right. So I just wanted to accentuate that point tonight, that, we're not talking about becoming more self-centered in the narrow self-defeating sense, but in a much deeper sense that includes our treatment of other people in it. I've said here several times in this meeting that many times the greatest sources of joy and happiness that I have in my life is being able to experience positive value when I have it. I don't always have it in the lives of the people I most care about, right? So that's one thing I wanted to point to again. Secondly, I wanted to talk briefly, because it overlaps so much with what you're saying. I was meeting with a client the other day, and this is a young man who's in recovery, who received a lot of negative messages about himself growing up from a pretty militaristic dad. And everything about this young man, he decided, was not who he was supposed to be. So it was just a classic situation of disowning himself over and over and over again and working so hard to try to become who he thought would make his dad happy. And as usually happens, he never succeeded, and still hasn't succeeded as a young man in that quest. But one of the things he developed a belief about is that he's not capable of all these things that you're talking about, Alan. He's not capable of dealing with life on life's terms. He's not capable of dealing with all kinds of situations that arise in his life. He's not capable of dealing with all kinds of emotions that arise within him. And several times over the last year or year and a half, I've talked with him about a big part of how we're able to make progress with this is which I, the letter I in quotes, within all those I's inside of me, I identify with, which part I, put my stock in. And so I asked him repeatedly over a number of sessions, whenever he was, making himself wrong or freaking himself out about people not liking him or feeling like people weren't responding to him in the way he said, I just asked with him to sit with that feeling for a while. And it happens over and over. Within a minute or two of sitting with his anxiety about that and not judging himself for it, he starts to feel better. So instead of going into this whole pattern and routine of, I've got to figure out the solution, I've got to figure out how to be different, I've got to figure out how to make these people like me, I've got to figure out on and on, which is his automatic, habitual, deeply conditioned way of going toward his environment. Within a minute or two of starting to tune into himself more, he realizes his ability to stand the feelings he's going through is really far greater than he thinks it is. But because he's identified himself with this I who's not okay, right, and who has to be different, it's like it's the last thing that it dawns on him to do is just sit with the reality of what he's experiencing. And then within a few minutes, he starts to feel at home in himself again. He starts to feel comfortable in his own skin. Yeah. And so I just wanted to share that perception. Often we come from a very childlike perspective. It's like the child in us does not realize we've grown up. The child in us does not realize we have matured and has no felt sense of connection to the grown-up in us. And I know all three of us pay a lot of attention to creating that connection, that relationship between the frightened and insecure parts of ourselves and the grown-up parts of ourselves. So those are the thoughts that I had. We need to help that little kid inside of us realize we really have grown up and we have some important things to offer him or her. So on that note, thank you.
One of the things that reminded me of, Roger, is this misguided loyalty. Because, you know, we talk about our incredible ability we have to adapt to whatever situation we're in, no matter how horrific it is, abusive it is, etc. And his desire to, the way that he got his dad's love, which was at such a heavy price, was to agree with his father, to cooperate with his father's idea of him.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, we got to understand that as part of the deal here. Is that desire to say, I'm going to take what my dad thinks about me, no matter how destructive, because it feels destructive when you're taking it on, but I'm going to cooperate with that. And I'm going to define myself according to my father's rules and ideas of me. And I'm going to live that out right at this point in time. And it's our way of trying to, you know, get that sense of connection that we're looking for, but albeit at such a price. And see, one of the things I think we learn here is we can get what we need without paying those kinds of prices, without, we call it a compromise. An unconscious compromise is when we make a compromise to that degree to hurt ourselves to get something we want. It's like my drinking and using was a solution, but my God, with a big price tag on it, right? It really did help at moments in my life, no question about it. But I paid a hell of a price for it. Today, I don't have to pay those prices. I can find other ways.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved. The forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. You know, the first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. You know, we're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.